buried my husband on a Tuesday in October, and by Thursday morning, my mother-in-law had already changed the locks on his storage unit. I didn't find out until later. That's the thing about grief. It blinds you just long enough for the people around you to do what they were always planning to do. His name was Franklin. He was 41 years old, a commercial real estate developer out of Boston, and he died of a brain aneurysm on a Sunday afternoon while he was making breakfast. No warning. No chance to say anything. One moment he was standing at the stove scrambling eggs, and the next he was on the kitchen floor and I was on the phone with 911 and I didn't even have shoes on. We had been married for 4 years. I was 32. I didn't know how to be a widow. The funeral was held at a church in Brookline, which was where his family was from. His mother, I'll call her my mother-in-law, organized most of it. She had that kind of energy, the kind that turns grief into logistics. She was at the funeral home before I was. She'd already selected the casket. When I arrived and said I wanted something different, she looked at me the way you look at a child who has said something embarrassing in public. I let it go. Franklin was dead. I didn't have the energy to fight about wood and lining. His brother was there. His 2 sisters, aunts and uncles, I had only met once or twice at holidays. They all cried beautifully, the way people do when they're being watched. I sat in the front row next to my mother-in-law, and I held a tissue I never used because I couldn't actually cry, not in front of all those people, not with her sitting so close to me that I could smell her perfume. I had met Franklin at a work conference in Chicago. I was in marketing, he was in development. We were both stuck at the same terrible networking happy hour, and we ended up leaving early and getting pizza at a place around the corner and talking until 2 in the morning. That was 6 years before he died. We spent 2 years dating long distance, him in Boston, me in Atlanta, before I moved up. I gave up my apartment, my job, most of my friendships. I built my whole life around his. I want you to understand that, so that what comes next makes sense. Franklin's estate was not a small thing. He had worked for 15 years building a portfolio, and by the time he died he had 3 commercial properties in the Boston metro area. 2 in Providence, a brownstone in the South End that we lived in together, and liquid assets that his attorney would later describe to me as substantial. He also had a life insurance policy. And he had a will. I knew about the will. He had told me about it when we got married. He had sat me down with his attorney, a man named Mr. Sheridan, who wore the same gray suit every time I saw him, and walked me through everything. It was thorough. It was clear. I was the primary beneficiary of almost everything. His family received some specific items, sentimental things mostly, and there were charitable bequests, but the bulk of the estate, the properties, the policy, the accounts came to me. I signed things. Franklin signed things. Mr. Sheridan signed things. Mr. Sheridan signed things. It was official and witnessed and filed. I forgot about it, honestly. You don't think about wills when your husband is alive and making eggs on a Sunday morning. The day after the funeral, I went back to the brownstone alone. My mother-in-law had asked, several times, in that tone she had, whether I wanted to come stay with the family during this difficult period. I said no. I needed to be in our home. I needed to be around his things. I needed to sleep in our bed even though I knew I wasn't going to sleep. I was right. I didn't sleep. I lay there for most of the night just staring at the ceiling, and somewhere around 4 in the morning I started going through his nightstand. Not for any particular reason, just to be close to something he had touched. There was a book he'd been reading, a phone charger, some receipts, a tube of chapstick. And at the very back, tucked under a notepad, there was an envelope with my name on it, his handwriting. I sat up. My hands were shaking before I even opened it. It was 2 pages, handwritten, and it wasn't a legal document. It was just a letter. He had written it, based on the date at the top, about 8 months before he died. After a friend of his had a health scare and Franklin had apparently spent a week thinking about mortality. He told me he loved me. He told me specific things about what he loved. The way I talked to strangers at parties, the fact that I always read the last page of a book before I started it, the way I made coffee. He told me that he knew his family could be difficult and that he had made sure everything was handled properly and that Mr. Sheridan had all the paperwork. He said he hoped I would never have to read that letter for a very long time. He said, "If you're reading this, I need you to know that you don't owe anyone an explanation. You built a life with me. That life is yours now. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I read that letter 4 times, sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning. Then I folded it up, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in my own bag. I didn't know yet how much I was going to need it. My mother-in-law called at 8:30 the next morning. She said she needed to talk to me about next steps. She said it in that business-like way of hers, the way that made everything sound like a meeting agenda item. I told her I wasn't ready to talk about anything yet. She said she understood, and then she kept talking. She wanted to know when I was planning to sort through Franklin's home office. She asked whether I had spoken to Mr. Sheridan yet. She said she assumed I knew that Franklin had some family obligations built into the estate that we would need to work through together. That word, together, landed strangely. We had never done anything together. She had tolerated me for 4 years because her son loved me, and she loved her son. That was the extent of our relationship. I told her I would call her later in the week. She said she'd prefer sooner. I said I'd call her when I was ready, and I hung up. That afternoon, my brother-in-law showed up at the brownstone. I want to be precise here, I did not invite him. He texted me 40 minutes beforehand to say he was coming by to check on me, and when I replied that I wasn't up for company, he said he understood and then showed up anyway. He is that kind of person. He stood in the doorway and he gave me a hug that lasted too long, and then he came inside without being asked and sat down at the kitchen table like he owned the place. He asked how I was holding up. I said I was getting through it. He nodded with the kind of exaggerated seriousness that people perform when they don't actually feel what they're pretending to feel. Then he said, "I know this is hard timing, but Mom is really worried about the properties." I looked at him. He kept going. He said that the family had been expecting, he used that word, expecting, that there would be some kind of restructuring after Franklin's death. That it didn't make sense for me, someone with no background in real estate, to be managing a portfolio of that size. That the family had been involved in Franklin's business for years, had helped him get started, had connections and relationships, and that it would be in everyone's best interest to talk about how to transition things properly. I asked him what he meant by transition. He said he thought it would make sense for the family to take over management of the commercial properties. He said this carefully, like he had practiced it. I said that those properties were part of Franklin's estate and that I was the executor and primary beneficiary, and that nothing was going to be transitioned anywhere without my explicit agreement and the involvement of the estate attorney. He smiled. It was a patient smile, the kind adults give children. He said, "We just want to make sure Franklin's legacy is handled by people who understand it." I stood up. I told him I needed to rest, and I walked him to the door. He left, but before he did, he said his mother would be in touch. That night I called Mr. Sheridan. What I didn't know when I made that call, what I found out in the weeks that followed, was that my mother-in-law had already contacted Mr. Sheridan herself. She had called his office 2 days after Franklin died, before the funeral, and had asked him a series of questions about the estate. He told me this, not because he had to, but because he had known Franklin for over a decade and he liked him, and I think he had already figured out what was happening. He told me the will was airtight. He told me the will was airtight. He told me there was nothing the family could contest with any reasonable chance of success. He also told me I should document everything and to let him know if anyone approached me with paperwork or requests. 3 days later, my sister-in-law, the younger one, the one who had cried the most at the funeral, called and asked if she could come get some of Franklin's things, personal items, she said. Things he would have wanted her to have. I said I wasn't ready to go through his belongings yet. She said she understood, and then she described specific things, a watch, some cufflinks, a framed photo from a family vacation. She said she just wanted something to remember him by. I said again that I wasn't ready, that I would reach out when I was. She called back 2 hours later. This time she wasn't as soft about it. She said that she knew Franklin had always intended for certain family pieces to be returned to the family, that she was sure it was an oversight that the will didn't specifically enumerate them, and that she didn't want it to become a legal issue. That phrase, become a legal issue. I wrote it down. I wrote everything down. from that point forward. Dates, times, exactly what was said. I kept a running document on my phone. Mr. Sheridan had told me to, and I was glad I listened. What I found out later, months later, during the formal estate proceedings, was that during the week after the funeral, while I was barely sleeping and barely eating and trying to figure out how to exist without the person I had built my entire life around, my mother-in-law and both of Franklin's siblings had met with their own attorney. They were exploring grounds for contesting the will. They were also, and this is the part that still makes me go quiet when I think about it, they were discussing whether they could argue that I had unduly influenced Franklin during his illness. He didn't have an illness. He died without warning, but that didn't stop them from exploring it as a legal theory. I know this because their attorney made the mistake of sending a letter to Mr. Sheridan's office that outlined their strategy in fairly plain terms. Mr. Sheridan forwarded it to me. I sat in my kitchen and read it, and felt something shift inside me. Not just grief, not just anger, something colder than both of those things. I had spent 4 years trying to fit into this family. I had driven to Brookline for every holiday, had remembered every birthday, had sat through dinners where my mother-in-law made little remarks that I smiled through because Franklin was there and he was worth it. I had moved my whole life to a city that was never mine. And this was what they were doing while I was in our home reading his letter in the dark. I called Mr. Sheridan back and told him I wanted to move forward. The contested probate process took 7 months. I'm not going to walk through all of it because honestly I don't want to relive it, and also because some of it is still technically under a confidentiality agreement. What I can tell you is the shape of it. They claimed I had manipulated Franklin. Mr. Sheridan presented 4 years of evidence to the contrary. Emails, documents, testimony from Franklin's own business partners who said he was meticulous and fully autonomous in all his decisions until the very last day of his life. They claimed the will was signed under duress. Mr. Sheridan presented the notarization, the witnesses, the timeline, and the fact that Franklin had updated his will 2 years into our marriage, and the changes had only further consolidated my position as beneficiary. They claimed that Franklin had verbally promised certain properties to his brother. Franklin's business partner, a man who had known him for 20 years, testified that Franklin had specifically told him he had no intention of leaving his brother any commercial properties, and had in fact described in some detail why. I testified too. I was terrified. I sat across from my mother-in-law in that room, and I answered every question clearly, and I did not cry, not because I wasn't grieving, but because I had made a decision that I was not going to perform my grief for people who were trying to take everything from me. The letter helped, not as a legal document. It wasn't that, but it was entered into the record as evidence of Franklin's state of mind and his intentions, his handwriting, his words. The judge read it. My mother-in-law's attorney tried to argue it was fabricated. Mr. Sheridan had a handwriting expert. That argument went nowhere. In the end, the will was upheld in full. My brother-in-law didn't look at me when the ruling came through. My sister-in-law cried, but differently than she had at the funeral. My mother-in-law sat very still and very straight, and then she stood up, and she looked at me for a long moment and she walked out. She has not spoken to me since. I won't pretend that doesn't sit in me in a complicated way. She was the mother of the man I loved. She is in her late 60s and she lost her son, and she handled that loss by turning it into a war, and I don't entirely know how to hold all of that at once. I think about it sometimes late at night, the way grief can curdle into something you don't recognize anymore. But I also think about what Franklin wrote. You don't owe anyone an explanation. That life is yours now. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I still live in the brownstone. I repainted the kitchen last spring, a warm yellow that Franklin probably would have said was too bright and then quietly gotten used to and eventually loved. I kept his books. I kept the chapstick from his nightstand, which I realize is a little strange, but I don't particularly care. I now manage the estate with a property management firm. I have a financial advisor I trust. Mr. Sheridan is still my attorney, and we have lunch twice a year at the same Italian place in Back Bay. The commercial properties, all of them, are performing well. I have learned more about real estate in the past 2 years than I learned in the first 32 years of my life. I am not an expert, and I don't pretend to be. But I'm not helpless either, And I wish someone had told my brother-in-law that grief does not make a person incompetent. It just makes them quiet for a while. I have not reached out to my mother-in-law or my brother-in-law or my sister-in-law. I made the decision, sometime in the middle of all of it, that I was not going to chase relationships that had revealed themselves to be purely transactional. That doesn't mean I hate them. It means I know what I know now, what I carry from all of this. The thing that actually keeps me going on the days when I miss him so much I can't breathe is that Franklin knew. He knew what his family was like. He knew I was alone in that city, that I had given things up, that I would be vulnerable if something happened to him. And he did everything right. He sat down with his attorney, he wrote his will carefully, and then he tucked a letter in his nightstand just in case. He couldn't stay, but he did everything he could to make sure I'd be okay. I think about that a lot. I think about the kind of love that thinks ahead like that, the kind that protects you even from a place you can't come back from. I'm okay. Some days I'm more than okay. I still read the last page of books before I start them. I don't know if I'll ever stop. I've thought a lot about what makes people do what Franklin's family did. Not to judge them, I've moved past that, mostly. But because I genuinely needed to understand it to stop being angry about it. What I came to is this. They didn't become those people the week he died. That was just the first time I had nothing left to lose by seeing them clearly. The greed was always there. The entitlement was always there. I had spent 4 years softening the edges of it, explaining it away, telling myself that my mother-in-law's comments were just generational, that my brother-in-law's overreach was just personality, that my sister-in-law's competitiveness was harmless. I made excuses because Franklin loved them and I loved Franklin, and that was a reasonable choice to make while he was alive. But the moment he was gone, I didn't have that cushion anymore, and everything I had talked myself out of seeing became impossible to ignore. Here's what I know about cause and effect. Stripped of anything mystical, the way you treat people accumulates. It builds a record. My mother-in-law spent 4 years treating me like a temporary inconvenience, and when the moment came that she needed me to trust her, really needed it, there was nothing there. She had spent it all. My brother-in-law walked into my kitchen 3 days after I buried my husband and lectured me about my competence, and he did it because he had always privately believed it and had never once had to examine that belief. That's not fate. That's just arithmetic. And on the other side of it, Franklin spent 4 years doing the quiet, unglamorous work of actually protecting me. Not just loving me. Protecting me. Making appointments. Reading documents. Writing a letter he hoped I'd never need. That accumulated too. Every one of those choices was a small act of integrity, and together they added up to something that held even after he was gone. I think about that when I'm facing something hard now. Not, will this be rewarded? I'm too old for that framing. But, is this the kind of choice that builds something or takes something away? It's a small question, but it clarifies things fast. The resilience part. The part I'm still working on, honestly, is understanding that surviving something difficult doesn't mean it didn't cost you. I came out of that 7-month probate process with everything Franklin intended for me to have. I also came out of it with a complicated relationship to trust, a heightened sense of who is actually safe, and a grief that got extended and complicated by the fight. I won, and it was still hard. Both of those things are true. What carried me through was not toughness in the way people usually mean it. It wasn't shutting down or powering through. It was something quieter, just deciding, over and over, that I was going to be honest about what was happening, document it, and handle it one step at a time. Franklin's letter helped. Mr. Sheridan helped. But mostly it was just the daily decision to not abandon myself to other people's version of the story. That's the thing nobody tells you about hard situations. The work is mostly just refusing to accept a narrative that was designed to make you smaller. My mother-in-law's version of events had me as a confused young woman who needed guidance. My brother-in-law's version had me as someone unqualified to steward what my husband built. I had to choose every single day not to live inside those versions. I chose mine instead. Franklin's letter reminded me I was allowed to.